So, good evening, everyone. Welcome back to Parabellum. With me are Eduardo Fontana, Daniele Moro, and President Maddaluno.
Good evening.
Global crisis. Why do we call it a global crisis? Because obviously, what is happening has a huge impact on a worldwide level. And we'll see it. There will be a lot of infographics for all the situations. Let's see. Before Winter was talking about fertilizers, let's talk about desalination plants, which are a crucial point of weakness for the Gulf monarchies. We will obviously talk about what the end state could be for the Americans, because obviously this operation doesn't make much sense. I mean, it's not really clear what they could gain from it. The Israelis are a separate issue, and that's all obvious. Just look at how the stock markets are doing. I would start with the political issues with Daniele Moro. I mean, Trump. Yesterday on CBS, he said that the war is almost over and could end soon. I'm telling you, from a military point of view, there's absolutely nothing complete about it. Yes, they've done a lot of damage. It must be said that the Israeli and American ability to cause damage is clearly superior to the Iranian one. The Iranian approach has been quite cautious. And then we'll analyze with Eduardo and Amadeo the military strategy chosen by the Iranians. But from the American point of view, in the meantime, it's not clear. 4 days ago, they wanted unconditional surrender. Then they said it would last a month. Now they say it's practically over. He has generals who will tell him, look, you need this time to achieve this. You can't just make up three things that contradict each other at the same time. We'll also look at the polls. Then in America, 3 out of 4 Americans don't want this war, which is interesting. Go ahead, Daniele.
Thank you again for the invitation. I'll immediately connect to the poll you just mentioned. If you go to the New York Times, a poll has just come out. From the time of World War II to this war, it shows how American public opinion, whether it was in favor or against, always goes down. Up until the war with Iraq, and just think that it ended in a disaster, it was around 70%. Now I think it's around 41%. The fact remains that this poll is the clear proof that democratic Americans, but also a very important part of the Republicans, do not want this war. Second, if you look at the podcasts again, I watched one an hour and a half ago. Americans, the question that Mirko is asking is the same one that analysts all over the world are asking themselves. That is, in 5 days, you change 5 different versions. I mean, you, Trump. Every time something happens, and something happens every day, you tell me a different story. One day you say the war is ending. One day you don't tell me it's a tender secret. One day it's something else. This is not the behavior of a head of state, but this brings us to the third issue. And it's my personal impression that I have developed. I remember the very night Trump was elected for the first time, I was live from Washington on Swiss television. I said something that made everyone laugh, all my friends. I said, look, Trump is neither a Democrat nor a Republican. And everyone was saying, no, he's a Republican, he's right wing. I said, no, listen, Trump is neither a Democrat nor a Republican. That's my answer. Trump is a character who changes his strategy every time, but he always relies on the same things. For those who have studied Trump's life before he entered politics, there's one thing, something that was told to him by the man who influenced him the most in his life about what had happened. Even the lawyer for a part of New York's organized crime, who was Roy Cohen, who told him, never admit you're wrong, always attack. If you think about it, this behavior precedes the president of the United States. It's Trump, no matter what. And I'll close with this thought. The reference you make, Mirko, to the Pentagon is obvious, because no matter how many generals he and that incredible character, the so-called Minister of War, have gotten rid of, very important American generals, The Pentagon is still full of capable people, people who understand. Besides, you have a lot of generals as guests. We all know from history books that if there's someone who tells you to be careful about going to war, it's precisely those who know what it means to wage war. In other words, the military. The military. I'll tell you one last thing. It's obvious that there's tension in Washington too, because if we as Italians are asking ourselves this, just imagine if the generals at the Pentagon of the United States Army aren't asking themselves the same thing.
That's the problem. I tried to find what could be an end state, what could be an economic or strategic reason. Actually, I only see problems. I set aside the issue of Israel, which we'll analyze separately later, since obviously they benefit the most from this situation. From a political point of view, the Gulf monarchies are putting pressure on them to end this war. Just now, I've also received some very specific, very precise rumors. The Emirates have asked the Americans to stop the Israeli attacks on Iranian oil because they fear that they will then be the ones to suffer retaliation from the other side. So they are very afraid of being the ones who get hurt. And the Americans, I think we've all seen the response, even if it's not official, from a billionaire from the United Arab Emirates who wrote an open letter. His name is Al Habtour, Khalifa Ahmad Al Habtour, who responded to Lindsey Graham, who made that post, where basically, for those who don't know, he's an American senator, usually very pro-war, who basically wrote on X threatening, it's not clear why we should defend the United Arab Emirates if they don't join us in the war against a common enemy. And he replied to him, this billionaire, but he's a very influential figure. He basically replied to him that they place great value on the lives of their children and will not treat their souls as collateral damage like some do. Nothing in the world is more precious than the lives of our children. No alliance with any country in the world is worth the risk to these lives. This is the more or less official answer because, after all, he is a very, very important figure in that world. This is the name for anyone who's interested. It's not very long.
I put the website in the chat. It's a group that goes from real estate to services, a big thing, this Al Habtour group.
Very big. So from a political point of view, they only have drawbacks. From an economic point of view, we know well, unless you have a bunch of speculators who knew all this was about to happen. And in that case, I give up. But on a global level, we know that all this will create a lot of problems for everyone in general. I mean, it's not like you're only hitting the Chinese, you're also hitting a lot more. We'll see it with all the economic charts. You're affecting many other countries. You're creating a rift that already existed within, anyway, the Western world. Let's look at Spain's response. Absolutely opposed. And especially from a military point of view, you can't win a war simply by bombing and with air power, especially with that kind of terrain or Iranian canyons and with the Iranian methodology. That is hundreds of small launchers that do the so-called shoot and scoot, meaning I go out, launch, and return in small sheds, small bunkers, or even bases in the mountains. You can superficially destroy what was outside. And that they are willing to lose bringing them out because they tried in the first days to fight back. But aside from that, they can even withstand a month of bombings, which in my opinion will also be done by the Rally on the Flag. So people, even if they don't love their own government, I don't think they like an external force that bombs them and causes collateral damage to civilians as well. In my opinion, in a week, they can easily come out and bring out the launchers again. And above all, to strike the Gulf monarchies, they don't need very advanced technology. The distances are short. Even their older missiles can easily hit the target. So exactly what is this strategy supposed to achieve? This is how I see it. In my opinion, it's absolutely unthinkable from a military point of view to achieve unconditional surrender or a regime change, as long as there are no boots on the ground, and I don't think anyone has the courage to do it. All of this is completely senseless. And it's incredible that the military are following them. What do you think, Edward?
No, I largely agree with this. Because as you were saying, even from a historical military history perspective, we can say it's very, very rare or even almost extremely difficult To find examples or cases of countries, especially those with significant economies and size, that surrender and are defeated. There's a regime change, basically, just through the use of air bombardments, no matter how violent. Often, in fact, when it happens, it's actually a mix of factors, among which the most important one, the one that's obviously mentioned, is the intervention in Libya.
Libya. It happened. It was a ground clash between forces.
Yes, in that case, which might be the closest among recent ones, I'm not sure if you all agree. Anyway, it was already seeing defections, or at least a situation on the ground that was definitely different. And I would also dare to say, let's say, some geographical features in Libya that make it much easier to use aviation. It's a desert country with no real cover and with the areas to be targeted even closer to the bases, while Iran is even bigger, as we said, full of mountains with all kinds of shelters, even bigger cities. So obviously, it's a titanic undertaking in comparison. And in my opinion, that's what they're actually trying to do. So, on one hand, as we said, Iran can actually go on for a long time with this kind of defensive strategy, meaning continuing to react the way it is doing, even while enduring the bombings. But from a military point of view, it's unlikely that the bombings will manage to destroy, for example, Iran's missile reserves, while it's likely that they will continue to hinder missile launches. This means that we may have fewer missiles launched in the medium term, but they will continue to be launched. And the same goes for drones, with the obvious factor that drones are easier to launch, and in any case, easier to prepare for launch. So
I'll show you two statistics. This is the missile launches. As you can see, it has remained constant for quite a while. Recently, there have been satellite images, specifically between the 6th and the 7th, showing that they were hitting depots, not so much the production, but the depots. And there has been a decrease. By the way, in these last 4 days, we've seen, but that's another topic we'll discuss and analyze better. Many videos of American drones, Israeli planes. In fact, they even made their own videos, and also Americans, which means that in some areas of Iran, they have a certain air supremacy. In some, they have superiority, but no one has ever talked about dominance. But this means that the resistance from the point of view of Iranian anti-aircraft capability is currently extremely low. It's interesting to see, especially from a statistical point of view, that more or less the launch of drones, apart from a drop on a single day, has remained constant. This means that although they manage from here, the missiles are in red, the drones in blue, you can see that there was even an increase on March 8th.
yes, and this is an important factor, especially for the Gulf, because drones obviously are almost no threat actually for Israel or even for the more distant American bases. But they are a very significant threat for all the countries facing the Gulf. And we've actually seen that it's often drones that cause that damage, even significant damage to military infrastructure or, in any case, critical infrastructure in the Gulf. I mean, it's not always ballistic missiles, which are obviously a bit harder to intercept, but quite often it's these drones as well. Probably also due to a general underestimation of the threat, maybe in the period before the conflict.
Also, a lack of preparation. You saw that they stopped trying to intercept them with missile systems. I saw a lot of classic anti-aircraft guns. You can see the tracers, and lately I've seen a lot of videos of helicopters.
Something that's similar to what we see in Ukraine. And in fact, they're kind of, let's say, copying those, let's say, that strategy, which at first started out a bit as a fallback. Also because in Ukraine, helicopters are often too vulnerable for other uses. But then apparently, when facing drones like the Shahed type, drones that, let's remember, fly very low and at a very low speed, actually using helicopters that are usually armed with automatic cannons. Almost all combat helicopters have automatic cannons, but even transport helicopters with soldiers assigned to machine guns. Basically, so they can fire from the side of the helicopter, just like in the video. This is an Apache, I suppose. And they turn out to be one of the most effective weapons, and I would even say perhaps among the most cost-effective. Because obviously, even systems like the Patriot can shoot down these drones if they get close enough. But in that case, the interceptors are, let's say, very expensive. So it's not practical to do that as a rule. So these are among the most effective methods in terms of cost effectiveness, and then they are used. I've seen a lot of fighter jets these days as well. Fighters from Gulf countries, F-16s, or in any case, fighters, even carrier-based fighters sometimes. In this case, however, just imagine the cost increases because a fighter jet, of course, has significant fuel consumption, and the weapons used are often very expensive as well. Especially in this case. Why? In theory, fighter jets could use their cannons to shoot down drones, but shooting down a drone with a cannon means getting close. So much so that there's a risk that the debris from the hit drone could damage the fighter jet's engine when it gets sucked in or otherwise gets hit.
Also, consider the costs of staying airborne to shoot down the drone.
Besides the costs, in Ukraine, Ukrainian fighter jets have done this several times. But I imagine that Russians fell during this mission simply because they were damaged by the explosion of the drone they were trying to shoot down with the cannon. So it's not that simple to face this threat. That's it. No, I'll conclude by saying that it's possible, in short, that this kind of exchange will continue. So on one hand, these launches could continue unless the reserves are destroyed, basically at a fairly stable level. While the Israeli-American side, let's say the challenge there is precisely to continue, first of all, to deeply monitor the bases from which the launches are made. And let's remember that they have to keep striking the bases, the underground ones, to basically seal them off. That is, to keep damaging the entrances to these bases. Or at least to monitor them so constantly, so continuously, that it becomes dangerous for the Iranians to use the mobile launchers, so as to make sure.
That's what you notice, right? If you mainly follow the headlines that map out the activity a bit, but also the type of American Israeli activity, the latest bombings are very concentrated, as you can see, on bases, drone launchers, drone depots. We have also seen factories that produced the Shahed itself. It was aviation industry that was hit. This means that they slow down production and not that they block the ones they already had and have put in storage. But it's clear that they have identified the problem, and the charts show it, that they still have a continuity of attacks precisely with drones. The exchanges, as you can see, are uneven. In red are the Iranian attacks. In blue are the attacks carried out by American and Israeli forces. And in light blue are all the countries more or less involved in this story. Lately, you've seen Macron on the aircraft carrier and so on. There's a reason for that. Cyprus is part of the European Union, so there are defense agreements, but there are also some long-standing agreements. As far as the division of Cyprus was concerned, if you remember, the guarantors, if I'm not mistaken, were Great Britain, France, and other countries. And since missiles have arrived, it's interesting that the missiles in Cyprus didn't come from Iran, but were fired by Hezbollah.
If I'm not mistaken, they were small drones and maybe even a missile. But the drones, or rather one of those drones, hit a hangar at the Royal Air Force Base at the British base in Cyprus. That's what caused the most sensation. But it was probably a very small drone anyway, and probably not a Shahed like the ones we know in Ukraine or the ones we talked about earlier, because those Shaheds are already quite large and can go really far. So those were the only ones that could be suspected of having come from Iran. But in reality, it seems to have been a smaller drone. And probably, as you rightly said, launched by Hezbollah from Lebanon. However, a few days later, the news was circulating. Here too, of course, we don't have certainty about how everything went, as you can easily imagine. But the news of a ballistic missile that does seem to have been launched from Iran. Why? Because it was the news about that famous missile, the one that was intercepted in the Hatay region, which is basically the far south of Turkey, right next to Syria, essentially. Where there's a red dot on the map, I see on the left side. Yes, that dot right there. And so this missile was one of those that was said to be headed toward Turkey. Now, in my opinion, that's not certain because, first of all, it was intercepted. That's what they declared. We also saw the photos from an exo-atmospheric interceptor. So outside the atmosphere, an American SM-3 launched from a ship. What does that mean? It means that it was probably still quite far from the target. So in theory, it could have even reached Cyprus if it had obviously been launched from Iran, heading towards Cyprus. The Turks, if I'm not mistaken, were also involved at a certain point, but correct me if I'm wrong, because I remember there were conflicting statements about this. The Turks had said in a statement, I believe, that it wasn't headed towards them anyway. So in my opinion, that was a ballistic missile headed towards Cyprus, launched from Iran. It's also consistent with, well, the interception that we saw.
As you can see, there are also a lot of Iranian attacks in the area where the Kurds are. So the news that the Kurds might have been about to do something Just to be sure, the Iranians hit the area where the Kurds are, as you can see. It doesn't make much sense, does it? Look, they've given them quite a bit of attention. In my opinion, the Kurds, seeing how Americans usually handle their agreements historically, it's not the best idea to start an offensive against Iran. And then if they just leave and abandon you there with a hot potato, right? So they're kind of holding back.
Even though they say every day that it's over, it's not like you really feel like.
Yeah, that's right. Then the Iranians, just to be sure, fired off something. We'll also look at the issue of air supremacy. We'll look at Italy's role, and we'll also look at a lot of other data. But I also have to manage, let's say, the interventions based on the technical issues. President Maddaluno, there's a question for you. Thanks for your analysis. Greetings to Mirko, and congrats on the live stream. Question: is Iran preserving missile capabilities for a second phase, or is it already experiencing degradation? Actually, I think I can answer this one myself. I'll let you handle the next one.
We have already answered.
I would say they've been stockpiling them for 40 years. Degrading them, meaning destroying the depots, is a bit difficult. They're hidden in the mountains. You can degrade their production capacity. The degradation happens spontaneously, let's say, either through launches or by destroying the launchers. I'm not going to show every single launcher. I've given you a link to an agency that deals with satellite images. Go there and you'll find hundreds of them. You can browse through them on your own. I've also given you a link to a website that, a bit like Oryx, is keeping track of the losses in this war, which is also very, very useful. So go there and you'll basically find everything that's added every day from both sides. I'd move on to economic issues now, which are actually the strong point of our Bocconi graduate, Strait of Hormuz.
But I apologize, I repeat, I apologize to the women and children, the minors who are watching us from home.
Let's start with this. The cost of the war obviously is estimated, but if it should, these are from Rende. They're not from Santa Claus. Rende is quite famous for those who follow the channel, and I think you know what it is. These are the costs of the American military operation at this moment. We are on day 9. If it lasts as long as they've declared, in practically 8 weeks, it will reach 100 billion, not counting the damages suffered.
Exactly, because here they're calculating the direct cost of this conflict. So launches, bombs, counter bombs, and so on. They're not calculating all the series of indirect costs. You know, when in these days we reported the news about the closure of the Strait of Hormuz, right away the smart ones showed up, the ones who know more than you. That's not true. The Strait of Hormuz is closed. Ships can still pass. Yeah, as long as they don't hit you with a drone or sink a ship. And what do the insurance companies do? Correct me if I'm wrong. The value of marine insurance is about 1/7, give or take, of the value of the ship, not counting the cargo, which is insured separately. So they're just small numbers, just small numbers. Multiply by the value of those ships for all the ships passing through the Strait of Hormuz. Multiply by the lawsuits. And I'm only talking about ships. I'm not talking about the air traffic they had at the airports in Abu Dhabi and Dubai, which are some of the most important hubs between Europe and Asia. So these are the direct costs of the war. You're not calculating the indirect costs. The oil that's not being shipped by sea, with Iraq having to suspend production because it doesn't have enough silos anymore. The famous tank farms to store the oil that can't get out, can't physically leave the country.
And let's say, excuse me, with these plants, you can't just turn them off. There's a huge cost to reactivate them. They have to be pressurized and so on. The same goes for the gas plants. By the way, notice how we'll see this with other charts as well. The Americans don't really depend much on this trade. It's the Asian countries, Europe, and partly China that depend on it a lot.
The Asian countries, no, but in fact, we'll get to that now, because I took a broad approach in answering your question about the direct and especially indirect economic costs of this war, but I'll get to the geopolitical aspect, which is the exciting one, the really interesting one.
I'll give you this infographic just like that. I'll tell you quickly. Basically, these are the millions of barrels that have been blocked in these 10 days. They are higher than during the Iranian Revolution crisis, the Yom Kippur War, the Iraq-Kuwait War, the Iran-Iraq War, and the war in Ukraine. If you combine them all together, they don't reach the current crisis.
Exactly, with funds like BlackRock, which have limited the ability to withdraw and redeem capital in general that they currently manage. For the most part, while they haven't done it all by themselves, a large part of it is Arab capital. Because earlier, Mirko, you mentioned the strong irritation, about which we have excellent, reliable, and significant sources, reliable sources, sorry for the repetition, from the Gulf Arab countries towards Mr. Trump. But there's also the American response, right? I mean, the Americans, in the end, they remind him who's in charge because they can put in the money. But the ones who provide the weapons and defense, well, it's the Americans. The Americans can always leave if they want to. As we always say, we were talking about the Kurds. The Americans are Olympic champions, gold medalists in throwing their allies away. The Russians get the silver medal, but the Russians are catching up. The Arabs live there. The Gulf countries live there. The message they are sending to the Iranians is if they burn us, we burn everyone. And the Arabs are understanding this message.
The other thing, as you can see, American exposure to the traffic is 2%, ours is 18%, China's is 50%, because it wasn't just taking from Iran, but also from all the other countries. India, 50%, South Korea, 65%, Japan, 72%. Even if everything went completely wrong and everything burned down, the Americans depend on it by 2%. It's easy to play when the beat belongs to someone else.
Unfortunately, I don't know if I can upload a small document.
Of course you can. Just share it and upload it.
It should be this one. Here it is. Perfect. This was posted today on LinkedIn by a French professor, Pierre-Emmanuel Thoman. I don't know if you can see it. It's in French. Try zooming in on it.
You can also zoom in on it. Try to zoom in on it.
Let's zoom in on it.
Let's zoom in on it from me to 2.
To zoom in, how do you zoom in more than this? Wait, no, I'll just share my screen. That's faster. So this one, it's faster this way. Here we go. I don't know if you can see. Can you see?
Let's see. I'll remove this, add this. There we go. Great tools.
You see this? This map is in French. But it's pretty easy to understand. What is that big blue ribbon that wraps around the heart of Eurasia, the famous heartland? Let me be a geopolitician for a moment and give you a little promo. Buy my books, you'll find these things in them. It's the so-called Rimland, the great global coastal belt. As you can see, this is the main area of intervention for all American wars, from the Korean War onward. These are not things I'm making up. They were updated since the early 1940s by a Dutch-born, American-adopted geographer named Nicholas Spikeman. Go back and watch the episodes that Mirko and I did on geopolitics. You know, there's a big debate between the different schools of geopolitics. How do you control the world? By controlling the sea routes, Mahan, Corbett, and so on, or by controlling the heart of Eurasia, which can't be attacked from the sea? Haushofer, and today, to put it simply, in some ways, Dugin, Mackinder, and so on. Between these two schools, Spikeman stands out, the doctrine of Spikeman, the thought of Nicholas Spikeman. It's not necessary to control all the countless sea routes. It's not necessary to control the heart of Eurasia. It's enough to prevent the heart of Eurasia, China, and Russia from reaching the sea and accessing the sea routes. That way, I get the maximum benefit with the minimum effort. You see, that's the Rimland, the arc that goes from Korea, then passes through Indochina. You see all the major American wars. It reaches Ukraine, of course, and passes through the Middle East. The Middle East is important for the Americans, even if it would be important for the Americans, even if it didn't produce a single drop of oil. Middle Eastern oil doesn't go to the United States. Let's stop saying that Bush went to war in Iraq for oil, that this is a war for oil. If a barrel of oil comes out for the friends at Chevron, that's fine, among friends, as Eduardo De Filippo used to say. But that's not the main reason. The main reason is that with that area of the planet, and I'm stopping the sharing now, it should already be stopped in that area of the planet. You connect all the oceans, Atlantic, Mediterranean, Indo-Pacific, to 3 continents, Europe, Asia, Africa. Everything passes through the Middle East. So whoever controls the Middle East here controls the rimland, and whoever controls the rimland controls the world. Basically, that's why United States efforts are focused there. Yes, by hurting Iran. You hurt China, you shut off an important oil supply to China, which actually gets more oil from Saudi Arabia and other countries in the area, or it can get it from Russia. So it's true, you hurt them, but above all, and here I go back to flights, to air traffic, you prevent the connection between China and Europe. That's what's important. Look at the air traffic these days. It has to pass under Saudi Arabia and also there, Yemen, where Air France had suspended flights in recent months last year because of the Houthi missiles. It has to pass very narrowly over the Caucasus until something happens over there too. The Caucasus is a hot area. There was the war between Armenia and Azerbaijan. There was the conflict. There was also a plane shutdown when it was flying over Chechnya. A civilian plane, 0 survivors. I mean, let's not even talk about Russia. The traffic between Europe and Asia passes through very narrow strips of sky. I'll wrap up this topic. What is the strategy, for example, of an Erdogan? Because it might sound like my fantasies, my speculations, but no, these are written documents. To control the large strip stretching from Istanbul through the Caucasus, site of the Azerbaijan-Armenia conflict, to Turkmenistan, the Turkic-speaking Central Asian countries, and then China. Because Erdogan has understood that if he secures that strip, he secures a highway that starts from China and reaches Europe, without needing to go through Russia, without needing to pass through Iran. So this is the reasoning. There would be many other things to say, but I don't want to take time away from the other speakers. But do you see how, starting from the economy, you get to geopolitics and vice versa?
By the way, people look at oil and so on and say, oh, well, gas prices will go up. No, look at what is produced. Everything. Pharmaceuticals, clothing, electronics, building materials, consumer products, a lot of things that go into cars and so on.
But I'm talking about bauxite. Let's forget about oil derivatives for a moment. Bauxite refining, aluminum. 10% comes from the Gulf countries because energy costs nothing there. It's an energy-intensive production. And they have smelters, bauxite refineries for aluminum in the Emirates, in Saudi Arabia, and so on. And we're not talking about copper from Oman because those deposits are still largely untapped.
Before passing the ball to someone else, I want to ask you one more thing. We saw the price of Barilla even reach 120, something like that, and then suddenly it dropped slightly. I think, if I'm not mistaken, now it's at 108, something like that, or at 88. Is this thing about using reserves possible? Many countries were talking about it, and this probably calmed the markets a bit. The problem is that these reserves last for a month.
They last for less than a month. I think they last for 3 weeks. Of course, correct me if I'm wrong. Yes, it's possible that part of the fever in the markets has subsided following that announcement, in my opinion, but I haven't checked the markets today. A lot was also due to this thing that Trump said. No, but it's over here. Can we wrap it up now? 86 now. Keep in mind the volatility of the markets. So we're talking about prices. Largely also about speculation, even about futures contracts, with oil tankers standing still in the Gulf. I mean, just as the markets can drop quickly, they can also rise just as fast. I don't just want to look at prices, I want to see the traded volumes of futures. And here the expert is Martina Besana, whom we greet. I want to see the real goods, the real oil tankers, because the legendary reserves of the G7 countries, it's not a month, it's 3 weeks, unless you correct me. So there's little reason to be calm about that.
Another issue, other bottlenecks, fertilizers. Actually, a lot of them come out, as you can see in Brazil, which depends 43%, or on the contrary, meaning they absorb.
Well, fertilizers are mostly made with oil, and if they're not made with oil, they're made with ammonia derivatives. The ammonia and urea plants, where are they made? They're made in Arab countries because they're energy intensive and energy costs nothing there. An important producer of urea, for example, is Algeria. The builders of urea plants are our renowned engineering, procurement, and construction companies, Bellelli, Bentini, Bonatti. Some of them no longer exist, and so on. They went to build in Algeria, so we have the expertise to build, but we build abroad because these are energy-intensive productions, and we create our own dependence. Now, I don't think that's wrong. I always think, as a geopolitical analyst, creating ties with countries, doing the so-called sweet trade where it makes economic sense. The problem is that if you build a near abroad, then you have to protect that near abroad. I mean, I'm not saying it's right or wrong, I'm just saying how it is. If you mess with the Russians near abroad, you make them angry, from Kazakhstan to Ukraine and so on. With Americans, if you mess with their near abroad, you drive them crazy. Cuba, Venezuela, all of Latin America. We've said everything about the Monroe Doctrine. We Europeans, if you mess with our near abroad, we help you destroy it. I mean, I'll always remember that man with the mustache, handsome and impossible, black eyes, and that Middle Eastern vibe, who ruled in Iraq, who one fine day said, you know what, the oil, pay me in euros. They found him in a hole and then hanged him. I can't remember what that man's name was. Maybe Saddam something. I mean, and everyone thinks about oil, but oil is just a part, a detail of the detail we're talking about here.
A friend, and also a friend of an Italian president, used to come here, set up his tent, and had a little habit
of wanting to create single African currencies. What was his name? He liked that, huh? You can't say we're there yet.
He had a son who played on a soccer team. The stock market trends, as you can see.
He was a cousin of Mubarak's niece, who was the uncle of, I forget, I don't remember those times.
We'll get to that, Federico Guarantini. Could the United States control the strait? There was talk of occupation, but I don't recall. There's a small island, actually the island of Hormuz.
But I think Karg Island is the one.
Yes, they could. Yes, the point is that it's not particularly indefensible, but most of the traffic goes through there. But when you have overwhelming air power and ships, what else do you need?
But Karg Island should be, as far as I know, not so important because it's right at the control of the strait, but also for its production capacity. Karg Island...
Yes, because 90% of Iranian traffic passes through there.
It's a very productive area, one of the most important. I remember that during the Iran-Iraq war, there were battles because the air and naval forces, basically, for Karg Island were heavily targeted.
Obviously, this crisis, if you look at the Israeli stock market, it's good for Israel, it's good for Russia. Because with the price of oil going up and the fact that Trump has lifted some sanctions on them, all the others, as you can see, are losing. Italy, Germany, France, Japan, Dubai, India, and so on, and also the United States, because they are starting to feel this burden. Earlier, we talked about the traffic, right? Hormuz, some are still trying. It's not completely blocked. There are some ships that occasionally turn off their transponders and appear on the other side, but essentially the traffic, as you can see, is minimal compared to what was happening before. Some still pass through. It's true that every now and then a Greek one, a Chinese one, a Russian one goes by. Those are, let's say, allowed in quotation marks. If you look at all the sites that track marine traffic, you'll notice a ship with a name disappear from one place and reappear somewhere else. So a few things get through, but it's a hell of a bottleneck in terms of traffic. Another key point which many fear is this total dependence that the Gulf countries and monarchies have. As for the desalination system, which is their Achilles heel, let's take a look especially at this infographic. Yes, it's Israel, it is, but it's hard to hit it. But most of the countries depend, some even up to 90%, on desalination systems, which are quite easy to hit. Actually, so they really fear that it could come to an exchange like this. Iran depends only 3 to 4%, so it's not a big Achilles heel for them. It's mainly for the Gulf monarchies, and I believe they don't want to go to such extremes. They know that if Iran decides to attack this particular asset, Kuwait depends on it 90%, Oman 86%, Israel 75%. But it's difficult. Saudi Arabia 70%, Bahrain 60%, Qatar 50%, United Arab Emirates 42%, Iran 2%. It's a bit like that chart we showed earlier about oil exports, where America was only, let's say, exposed to 2%. In this particular situation, it's the Iranians who have a knife pointed at the Gulf monarchies if they wanted to. And maybe that's the reason why all the Gulf monarchies are pushing not to take the war to the extreme. Javelin. Guys, to plant and harvest wheat, you need diesel. Same for feeding the animals. Another problem is food. These countries don't produce a single carrot, so they're also very dependent from that point of view, as well as financially and in terms of stability. If today I was looking at the housing markets over there, real estate minus 25%. If you want to buy a house now in Dubai, minus 25%. In places where a square meter costs, I don't know, 100,000 or more, if you find places, you probably pay even more, especially near luxury locations. We're talking about huge losses in value.
But you can buy my course on cryptocurrencies, which are yes.
Yes, look at me with the Bugatti here by the pool and so on. Israel is not using nuclear weapons to promote the war and makes the use of ground forces inevitable. Israel will never be able to use nuclear weapons in any country. Clear this stuff from your mind. I don't know where you read it. Nuclear weapons are not part of this kind of conflict. Israel has nuclear weapons as a final deterrent in case there were countries capable of threatening its integrity. The problem is that in a nuclear exchange, Israel is a very small country. It has everything to lose. It really takes very little, just a small amount of nuclear potential to harm Israel.
Mirko, add this book that I'm sending in the chat, since I'm quoting it a lot. The Myth of Nuclear Politics, The Myth of Nuclear Revolution.
I'd like to ask Daniele something, since a huge debate is opening up and the Americans, as we can see, are extremely opposed even within their own world. The vast majority are against it, 74%. The Republican world is against it, depending on the polls, from 40 to 50%. So 1 out of 2, those who really say yes, are less than 30%. I don't know, the rest are in the middle. Beyond the fact that this war makes no sense, we can't find any sense in it from an economic or strategic point of view, the end state and these kinds of things. From a political point of view, he ends it now, goes back home, then what? Does he make up that the mission is accomplished, we've won, things like that? Because if he keeps it going and then the elections come, in my opinion, he loses everything in this sense, even from a political point of view. It's a huge risk for Trump. He takes it. Maybe it would have made more sense to do it right before the elections to create a distraction. But now, from my point of view, there will be plenty of time even for the voters to analyze whether it was successful or if it was just a useless waste of resources and money. Can you understand what the political strategy, not the military one, behind this story is?
No, I can't. And I have to say that almost no one else can either. If you think about it, already last April, when he started with that story about tariffs, all the observers, all the American observers said that what he was doing was unconstitutional. The Supreme Court took 10 months to tell Trump and the rest of the world that he couldn't apply the tariffs. So arguing with allies, friends about tariffs. You can also see it in the American press this morning. There are some very interesting investigations, because the average American, as we always remember, is a person who usually has very little savings, who is really tight on budget, really very tight. He tried to ask for his money back after the Supreme Court ruling for what he had to pay to buy, I don't know, some goods. In China, there was a family who said, I think we wrote to FedEx asking for our money back since it was illegal to charge us customs fees. FedEx replied, look, we are more than ready to refund you. As soon as Trump sends the money back to us, we'll forward it to you right away. So you understand that you have millions of Americans, and it's not about being right-wing or left-wing, a Democrat or a Republican. It's just an average lower middle-class consumer who has already paid the price. Then the real issue, which everyone who follows your channel knows a lot about, is the price of gasoline. The price was around $2.30, $2.35, depending on the state. Trump went just last week to say that it had gone down everywhere. Even then, economists told him, look, Mr. President, it has gone down. But not as much as you say. It's getting close to $4. Let's go back to what we were saying before. The average American is used to paying for energy in a system where there is very little public transportation. You need also, because of the vastness of the country, to get around by car, so you notice it immediately. You know that gasoline is practically not taxed at all in America. When you touch it, you don't even have any margin as a government, unlike what is discussed in Italy and Europe, where they say, let's lower the excise taxes a bit. You have no margin. But I want to say something. The opposition still doesn't exist, the democratic opposition. In my opinion, the average American voter who is infuriated by this situation and will be even more so in the coming months. It's not that they won't vote Republican also because the elections will have to be held at the state level and so on. It depends on how the representatives, senators, and Republican candidates will position themselves. That, in my opinion, will be one of the points that could lead to a split. First, the Make America Great Again movement, we've already talked about it in the past few days, is basically against the war in Iran because they say, we elected you, you told us you wouldn't start any more wars, that our children wouldn't go off to die around the world anymore.
Some people actually believed it.
But this morning you sent us back. You sent us back 7 coffins. 7 coffins aren't many. But be careful when they asked Hegseth, excuse me, but do you realize that we are sending our men to die? He said, well, these are the things that happen in wars. And you say, my friend, it's obvious that these things happen in wars. But I voted for you because you said you wouldn't do it anymore. While Biden, Obama, and Harris were starting World War III, these are, in my opinion, the points where American society could break the trust pact with Trump. I still think that the fact that she's extremely angry with Trump doesn't necessarily mean it will lead the Republicans to lose the elections. I think it's too early to say today, but I'll add 2 things. In May, the term of the Federal Reserve presidency expires. Trump hammered Powell for a year, who, by the way, had been appointed by Trump himself, saying, I'll fire you because you don't lower interest rates. Here's the question I have for you. But with this oil situation, with a war you've entered and have no idea how to get out of, but do you really think that even by changing the leadership of the Federal Reserve, you would be able to lower the cost of money? Absolutely not. You might even have to raise it, whether Powell is there or not. Second thing, there's the story of the World Championships. The World Championships, we talked about it last week too. They keep making headlines, negative rates in bookings. Third thing, last night some airlines, after what happened in the Gulf, immediately passed on the increase in oil prices to passengers on transatlantic routes. So this affects not only the World Cup, where bookings are going to Canada and Mexico and not to the United States, but it also affects the regular, normal, intercontinental tourist routes to the United States of America, meaning it also affects American airlines. So you have data that tells us that American companies will definitely suffer a lot in the coming months. But I'll finish with something that I care about a lot. we all human beings keep thinking, at least I do, that if you become the president of the United States, or I don't know, the Pope, you do a job that's extremely important for humanity. Unconsciously, we all think that if you've been appointed president of the United States, it's because you're good, because you have a strategy and you don't want to tell us. It's a tender secret and so on. Well, if you read history books, they're full of idiots who, for 1,000 reasons, end up in important positions. But this also happens in companies. I mean, you don't need to go to the Vatican or to Beijing or to Moscow. The world is full of situations where people who are incapable of managing very important realities end up causing trouble. And if we try to find logic in their behavior, the first ones who don't understand what's happening are us. In some, when you ask me, how does it end up? But look, the question you're asking is being asked all over the world.
But look, it's kind of what happened.
He's the only one not asking himself that.
It was kind of what happened. We did a live stream just before this mess happened with Colonel Sturper on the mistakes of Russian, American, and European intelligence, etc. And everyone absolutely got the prediction about Putin's moves wrong because they considered him a rational actor. We take it for granted that everyone is a rational actor.
Absolutely, absolutely. I'll tell you something that I think very few people noticed. As soon as Putin invaded Ukraine, the Israeli intelligence, so we're talking about an intelligence agency that, generally speaking, not always, because they've also made some huge mistakes in Israel's history, but usually they get it right. They, 3 days after the invasion, were sure that Putin would win. The Israeli intelligence asked the Israeli government, which complied, to protect the small Jewish communities in the territories of Ukraine that were about to be invaded. So it tells you that even very, very, very well-equipped intelligence agencies can make mistakes. This is a fundamental point, because otherwise you won't survive in analysis if you don't add a dose of it. I always say one thing: if you look at the life of Trump is a man who has accumulated 34 convictions, 6 bankruptcies. He has always lived between going to jail or becoming president of the United States of America.
In Italy, he would have been at least prime minister.
For Trump, it didn't end there because he dressed up as the Pope. He wanted the Nobel Peace Prize. He wanted it just a month ago, guys. I mean, in a month. So, well, when you're faced with this kind of personality, you have to think, but this happens to any human being. It happens to me. It happens to anyone. If you win 5, 6, 7 times and things go well for you, as a human being, you tend to think that you'll always win. In this case, since there isn't a strategy, you are the experts, aren't you? In all wars, the problem isn't how to start them. The problem is being clear about what you want and how you end it. Whereas the Israelis, and I imagine you want to talk about this, in my opinion, they have a very clear strategy. In fact, if you look at the debate in the United States, many people say so. Trump is a fool who let himself be made fun of by Netanyahu, who dragged him into this situation because Trump is basically a sucker. And Netanyahu, yes, he's clever.
Well, definitely, exactly.
Doctor, excuse me, but Giopino is very Bergamasque. Where did you hear it?
Definitely the Israelis have their own strategy, which is actually the same, to keep starting wars so they don't have to deal with internal political issues. In this, you can see that Netanyahu is extremely skilled at dragging the Americans in and waging a war that absolutely does not serve their interests. With the Israelis, money talks. Look at the Israeli stock market, and they've definitely managed to reduce the damage a lot. In fact, I think the Israelis would really like it if the Iranians started hitting desalination plants or the oil sector of the Gulf countries, because that might push them closer to the Israelis. I don't know. I think most of the blame would fall on the Americans and not on them.
But Mirko, who has the best desalination technologies over there? Actually, who has the best desalination technologies on the planet, on planet Earth? The Israelis, I mean. What I hear around is that Italian companies that make construction materials and advanced construction materials, I'm not saying they're thrilled about buildings coming down in Dubai, but almost because we have the best construction technologies and building materials in the world since the times of ancient Rome. We don't say it, but it's one of the sectors where we have absolute leadership. Same thing for the Israelis with desalination.
Let's also talk about Italian issues. Apart from the latest news, which is unconfirmed but is in all the newspapers, that the Iranians are mining the strait. And not by chance, earlier I showed you what Trump wrote. That is, if they don't comply with his demands, America will hit them 20 times harder than what they've done. It's interesting, in 4 days we've gone from peace, lasts only a few days, we'll hit you 20 times harder, surrender on our terms. You understand that you can't reason on a rational level with these statements. Here, there's an interesting question that Morgano, a free man, asked. I mean, how much of this is Trump? How much is he being influenced by the Israelis? And how much is instead Rubio or others in this story? Because it's obvious that Trump's statements are completely disconnected from reality. There's no declared end state. It's not obvious. With Bush's missions, it was generally clear what he wanted. Go after those responsible, take down dictators, seek revenge, more or less, in a broad sense. Here, there isn't a goal. In the meantime, welcome to Danilo as well.
Thank you.
Because there's talk of possible occupation of some islands, possible special forces missions. I notice a struggle even within the American sector, that is, among the military. We've done our part, let's get our butts home. As long as this thing lasts 2 weeks, if it goes on longer, inevitably, at some point, there's a risk. I don't know if you agree, Danilo, that when you get into a war, which is more or less what happened in the war in Ukraine, you get into a war, you expect it to end quickly, and then just to avoid accepting it or just to go after that thing you didn't get, you get more and more involved. And I see this risk here in the story, especially in Israel, America, and Iran, the thing we should be working on in the coming weeks. Here it is.
I fully agree. The first analysis that we are all making in the end is this. The Russians entered Ukraine and thought they would take Ukraine in 3 days, and it's been 5 years that they've been there fighting. The Americans, they arrived believing they could overthrow Khamenei, expecting the people to be fed up and ready. And these people will support us. They'll take to the streets. They'll act. They'll undo things. In fact, it's true that there were even messages like, oh, now you can go, you can act, we support you, this and that, but nothing happened. So the bubble of rebellion, let's say, somehow for one reason or another stopped. And at this point, they have to decide, what do we do now? Do we stop and pretend nothing happened? Do we try to find a way out, in quotes, let's say an elegant one, or do we move forward? And when, because this news came out that they were thinking about putting boots on the ground. I made a video about it, one of my shorts that I published last week. When I read boots on the ground, my hair stood on end. I mean, the hair on my head, because boots on the ground becomes, I mean, Cambodia would be a walk in the park in comparison, going into Iran, going into those kinds of situations. But if they keep going like this, in the end, they'll have to do something different. Bombs from the sky can only do so much. Everyone knows that. Bombs from the sky are used to annihilate, to soften up the situation, to create, let's say, that foundation to allow entry on the ground. But there also have to be the conditions to enter on the ground, conditions that at the moment
Let's take advantage of this point you just made about the conditions. So I want you, Eduardo, since you interacted on this topic, to talk about the Italian role in this war, a passive role. I mean, please, Eduardo, because I imagine we are interested after all.
Let's say, obviously, to reassure everyone, there are no Italian Air Force planes, fortunately, striking Iran. However, there is still a role in this conflict, which is not just the one that Amedeo pointed out earlier. That is to basically be international partners, more or less willing or more or less compliant, depending on your point of view. But there is also a significant role, let's say military in every respect, particularly related to logistical support and reconnaissance support. We could define it this way. So yes, this is directly military support. What am I referring to?
No, Eduardo. We neither condemn nor approve, remember?
Yes, no, on the surface, all of this falls under neither condemning nor approving. Obviously, it has no significance, no relevance. But actually, if we also look at what it is technically, it's not even something so insignificant. So let's get straight to the point. Outside of the discussion about logistical support, it's hard to investigate the extent of this support, but it's certain that it exists. There are obviously United States bases on Italian territory, and they are also documented during this period, basically allowing aircraft to pass through, especially transport and refueling planes, and so this is clear. But the support, perhaps a bit more critical, that Italy provides by making its own territory available. He's referring exactly to the image you're seeing right now. In Sigonella, a base, one of the most well-known United States bases, in this case in Sicily, an air base basically from Sigonella. Some of the drones operating there are called Triton drones. These are not the small expendable drones we talked about earlier. These are actually some of the most important drones for reconnaissance and also for facilitating communication between various forces on the ground. What do I mean? These drones are basically large unmanned airplanes with very long autonomy. Imagine that they take off from Sigonella. So obviously we're also talking about very expensive assets. These drones are equipped with practically every kind of sensor, ranging from radar to infrared sensors, and even passive sensors to detect the electromagnetic emissions of the adversary. Their main usefulness is to scan the ground or the sea, depending on the situation, with a radar, let's say, of high capacity. And this means that they are used, especially in these days. By the way, what you see, the thread, in fact, that you are seeing on my profile, it refers to a case from a few days ago when one of these drones basically left its transponder on, so it remained visible to aircraft tracking sites. And so its entire flight was seen, which brought it close to Bushehr, basically near the Iranian coast. Another significant factor is that it even penetrated Iranian airspace in this case, because it got so close to the coast that it basically entered Iranian national airspace, which obviously in that area, so we can also assume, is now quite secure along the coast. Because these drones fly very high, but radar-guided defenses can still threaten them. Here you can see the path that was taken. Obviously, in this case, not by me, but by a site called Itamil Radar, which is quite well known as a site that basically tracks these aircraft. But you can also find it on all the free tracking websites. When they forget to turn off the transponder, you can see these interesting flights. Well, what was our drone doing there? We said reconnaissance, which can mean both checking the damage, first of all, caused by the United States Air Force at Bushehr, which is also a military base that had been hit in the previous days. So with the very effective radar that these drones have, they can identify the damage and also detect things. It's one of those assets that's useful for doing what we mentioned at the beginning of the episode, that is detecting missile launches and finding others.
The Triton that disappeared, did it take off from Sigonella? Was it one of those?
The Triton that disappeared, I'm not sure which one you're referring to, maybe one from the previous days.
In the first days.
Yes, it's possible because it would be necessary to see if in fact the code matches. Anyway, if the trajectory it comes from is enough, that one is possible. By the way, this is actually documented, meaning it couldn't have come from anywhere else. A few days earlier, there was a second case, which I think is the one you're referring to. Notice that if you look, it actually makes loops in front of Boche. That means when these drones arrive, they stay there for many hours. These are very, very important aircraft. Also, as I said at the beginning, to facilitate communication, they basically work as relays. They fly very high, stay fixed in that area, either over the sea or the coast, and more or less circle the same route for several hours. Also to ensure that communication between various United States military units can take place beyond the horizon. In a way that's extremely critical in this case. And so from this point of view, in my opinion, it is the single, let's say, most significant support. The single or collusion, we could say, with this military campaign that Italy has in this case. In this case, obviously, these are the results of the agreement that manages the use of the bases essentially on Italian territory by the United States Air Force, or in any case, by the United States Armed Forces. It would be quite different, in my opinion, to allow the use of these bases, but with weapons instead. But it's also not very plausible because with the distances involved, there wouldn't really be this need. However, to conclude, in short, this is a significant use both offensively, as you have noticed, but also theoretically defensively for the Gulf countries. Because there's nothing to say that this drone doesn't also help prevent, or at least helps defend against, drone and cruise missile attacks directed at the Gulf countries. So it's useful in that sense as well. Let's move on to this other one.
Before moving on to that, I'll tell you, because there's a big discussion that I was also involved in, the one about Crosetto weapons and these things. It's a very Italian topic that interests us because I, through some connections that the president also knows, simply heard a voice, a rumor about the fact that he wasn't there on vacation. But he took the opportunity, let's say, to also offer some Italian systems. And coincidentally, a couple of days after I said this on Even Greco, all the articles about the SMPT and Skynex started coming out in collaboration with the Germans and many other things as well. In your opinion, this it's defensive anyway, right? So there's not a big Italian involvement. What do you think about this, Danilo? We offer ourselves because we offer ourselves because there's a shortage of ammunition. All these countries depend for the vast majority on American systems. And as we've seen, they've started having a lot of problems intercepting, so much so that we showed it live at the beginning. They're starting to use helicopters against drones. So I don't understand this controversy. I mean, do people really believe that Crosetto was there and just got caught up in this war? They believed in this war.
It was Crosetto who said it. Crosetto was the first to say that he had to. I even did a live stream about this. He had to. He had to make some trips for service, for work. Let's call them that. He also wanted to take a vacation. If we want to understand it in a human way or as political pressure that they might experience, especially in these times, he said, if I go on a business trip and then stop to take a vacation, they'll give me a hard time, so I just go on a vacation trip. Then when I'm there, in the meantime, I also do my own trip. I take care of my appointments, my things, and then I come back calmly. This way, no one can claim I used the business trip for personal reasons. In the end, one of the jobs of the Minister of Defense is also this. I mean, if we want to have a market, if we want to have a business, ladies and gentlemen, we can talk about war, play it, sing about it as much as we want. We can have any kind of political idea or whatever. But war is a business. I mean, war is basically a business. Anyone who starts thinking that war is an act of anything else is being fooled by another political side that wants to sell it to them as a mission. Because we're all good, we're all kind, and we all want to fix everything. Also, if you allow me to say this, if we really wanted to fix the world, just think of how many places we would theoretically have to bomb, right? To fix it according to our own idea, which is another thing we could discuss. From a military and strategic point of view, the use of our forces in support and assistance. Yes, it's true. If we look at it that way, we can see it as help for the United States, as assistance to Israel, as help in this war against Iran. If we want to look at it another way, anyway, as they say, if I start to deploy my forces, it's a step forward to defend myself. If things were to turn a little bit in a different direction, right? So maybe Iran, which has decided to bomb all the Gulf countries, maybe they feel like it, they say, you know what? I'll start to launch even towards Italy or towards those countries where my missiles can reach. I was looking, I don't know if you posted it. I think you posted it in the chat. I was looking at the range of Iran's various missiles. Where am I? I'm in Slovenia, and I was talking with my colleagues in Slovenia, and I said, guys, you're fine. It just barely reaches. You can relax. So the deployment of our equipment sent to certain positions is indeed a help for what's happening, but it's also strategic for our own personal interests. In my opinion, both from a defense point of view,
but I also don't see.
Also from an economic point of view.
Let me add something though, because I've actually dealt with this topic in the past few days. And so if we're talking about sending, let's say, defenses to the Gulf, which is what was being discussed, either ships basically for anti-aircraft use or the SAMP-T, so again, for anti-missile and anti-aircraft use, they would be useful basically to defend the Gulf countries from Iranian missile launches, and in this case, also from ballistic missile launches, because the SAMP-T systems, as well as others, can do that too. The interceptor missiles on the frigates are able to intercept short-range missiles that reach the Gulf countries. So in this case, they would also be useful against ballistic missiles. But paradoxically, this is kind of my objection. If Iran decided to launch a ballistic missile all the way to Italy, let's say to Sicily, our systems there would no longer be able to intercept it effectively. Exactly, staying close by, because these are weapons, systems, terminal defense systems, so they basically need to be close to where the missile lands. And moreover, maybe we can discuss it further with Mirko, if there's time, Moreover, even the most modern SAMP-T systems we have today probably wouldn't even be able, not even in Sicily, to intercept the ballistic missile we want. Exactly, hypothetically launched from Iran for basically technical reasons. Because a weapon that comes from so far away is beyond the specifications of the range that it can intercept. A modern SAMP-T, you see, only now are more modern SAMP-Ts entering service, but even those would be in trouble. I mean, the defense, let's say from a hypothetical, really hypothetical, Iranian launch, since I don't want to cause alarm, would make little military sense even for Iran. Because then they would be extremely inaccurate launches, rare missiles that could actually reach here. And with small warheads, however, they would obviously be, let's say, political launches that would cause a big scandal. But the defense against these launches would not be helped, as of today, by Italian defenses, precisely deployed nearby. However, they would help defend the Gulf countries or economic interests, yes, but not the defense, let's say, of the national territory from ballistic weapons launched from Iran. It would basically depend on the American systems. At the moment, there aren't any others except for a static system that's in Romania, the Aegis ashore in Deveselu, and then some ships, if in fact some destroyers remain deployed, which the United States usually keeps stationed in the Eastern Mediterranean precisely for this task. And at the moment, so actually even technically for Italy, it wouldn't change much, let's say. That's why I also pointed out in my post, if you saw it, I highlighted how the involvement in this conflict was increasing. Also a bit to raise awareness, because at the moment, okay, it's very unlikely, but there are almost, let's say, risks of future retaliation. Then, by the way, I was also thinking a lot about terrorism, something that one day, if unfortunately this war goes on for a long time, and again, unfortunately, Iran becomes a failed state. Basically, we need to keep all the possibilities in mind, because when we see Trump or we see these videos, exactly the ones we're watching now, of attacks that start hitting crucial sites of the Iranian economy, I think the risk that
aren't even huge. I don't know if you've seen where oil is raining down.
But even inside the pipelines, I remember, there was an oil leak a few days ago, and at one point the streets in Tehran were on fire. It's apocalyptic stuff. If you look, you'll find a video where there was an oil leak in the pipelines. Yeah, along a road, and at a certain point it caught fire. So to conclude,
I'm really afraid of this. I mean, the fact that it's an oil facility, well, they have nothing left to lose.
Exactly. I'm really afraid of this. And in my opinion, this is the most nightmarish scenario. I mean, if what Trump says, he actually does. So you don't surrender, all right, we'll send you back to the Stone Age, I would say. And then to a country of 90 million inhabitants, if I'm not mistaken, just imagine. Exactly. Let's remember the terrorism with Libya destroyed, Syria destroyed, and so on. Obviously, immense tragedies. Let's just think about the terrorism of a country with 90 million inhabitants that is no longer able to be a country. Maybe that...
Here, if you want, Eduardo, and if Mirko allows me, I'll raise my hand, because I'm convinced that this is exactly the plan. We have 20 or 30 years of literature, the project for a new American century, the project for a new American century on which Dr. Moro could instruct us for hours. The plan made by Colonel, I can't remember who anyway, a colonel from the Marine Corps Strategic Studies Center who talked about the greater Middle East. There are quite a few maps about this, right? I mean, a strategic plan to break up Middle Eastern countries, some of which include Iran, according to ethnic lines. In turn, These plans are a revival of the so-called Yinon Plan, which was created by an Israeli officer, Oded Yinon, published in the magazine Kivunim, which is one of the journals of the International Zionist Movement. These are projects written in black and white, which foresee the erasure of Arab countries, or at least Middle Eastern countries. Not only the Arab ones, breaking them up along ethnic lines to send them back to the Stone Age and basically render them incapable of causing harm. That is, if you take those populations and push them back by a few centuries, a few millennia, even back to the pre-Islamic tribal period, they won't cause you any problems anymore. And I go back to what Spikeman said, right? That is the region of the world to control, and this is the best method to control it. Now, some of these countries are very well suited for these operations, right? There were neoconservative political figures who, after September 11th, were saying, we will destroy 6 Arab countries in 6 years. Syria, Iraq, Lebanon, Yemen, Sudan, Libya, or all destroyed. Not in 6 years, but over a much longer period. In fact, these countries fit very well with the Yinon Plan or the Project for a New American Century. Call it what you want, because they already have strongly tribalized social structures, meaning what was the national sentiment in Iraq?
Go back and watch the live streams we did of
What a live stream we did.
About Libya. And even Gaddafi had 3 military forces because he had to keep them separate anyway, also to avoid internal problems.
Libya, even less than Iraq. Libya is just 2 lines that we and the French drew in the desert, and that's it. So these are countries where there is a sense of tribal belonging, then there is a sense of belonging to Arab identity and to the Islamic Ummah. But the feeling, the one in the middle, the national feeling, is barely there or hardly exists at all. It's something that really only started about a century ago.
Since we're here, Amadeo, how much does this Sunni Shiite story matter in this big...
In my opinion, it matters much less than what our people tell us, much, much less. I mean, clearly there's an identification with the Shiites or an identification with the Sunnis. But for example, the Shiites themselves have their own allegiances towards, they are divided into 10,000 subsects themselves. Because those from Yemen, the Houthis, are a group of Shiites. Those from Iran are Shiites. Twelfers like the Lebanese Hezbollah, then there are the Ismaili Shiites, then there are the subsects like the Syrian Alawites. It's a mess, but even among the Twelver Shiites, there are different currents. Those closer to communism, to the Velayat-e-Faqih. The guardianship of the jurist is something that originated in Qom, Iran, from those parts. The more quietist ones who follow al-Sistani in Iraq, a very elderly, very authoritative Ayatollah who is not particularly pro-Iranian, and so on and so forth. So even there, each current has its own subcurrent that intersects with family and tribal loyalties. In all this mess, the Arab countries, in fact, are very prone to tribalization. The Arabs originally emerged as nomadic tribes. History teaches us this. Lawrence of Arabia teaches us this. That is, it's the prophet who takes these nomadic tribes and turns them into an empire. The Persians know. That is, this game of trying to break up Iran, let's take the Baloch, let's take the Kurds, let's take the Azeris. It really risks ending badly, because the Persians have an ancient national sentiment like that of the Greeks, the Italians, and the only Arab people who have one, that is the Egyptians.
One is gone, also reported live by Cable News Network 14 minutes ago.
Iran targets the Strait of Hormuz.
That's exactly it. If I go down, you go down too.
Exactly. I really end it. I shut it down. I shut it down. For example, one of the games they try to play, that the Israelis try to play with the Turks, is that they hold on, they pull the leash. And we use the Azeris. Against the Azeris, they have a decent military force. Let's use them for limited interventions in northern Iran. But even there, the Azeris are a Turkic people. They are a people of Shia religion. Iranian Shiism, the Safavid dynasty, comes from Azerbaijan, a Kizilbash movement. Azeri Shia sect, Khamenei father and son are of Azeri origin. So this very European idea of taking one ethnicity and pitting it against another, like in Yugoslavia, goes beyond the concept of Persian identity, of civilization, which is supra-ethnic and exists in those regions. So you really don't know where this game can lead you. You truly don't know where it can take you,
But me,
but also, look, this is the ecological damage. I showed you videos where people touched the cars and found oil on them. This is Tehran now. It's dark, it's raining. Literally, oil is pouring down. I don't think people really like this stuff. Would you like it, regardless of whether you like your government, but they cause you this kind of environmental damage?
these geopolitical engineering projects always lack the culture, the knowledge of that country. I'll really keep quiet now. Last telegram. Here we're telling ourselves that now freedom is coming soon to Iran, right? We have the Benigni syndrome, the American soldiers arriving on tanks to liberate us, even though Auschwitz was actually opened by the Soviets. But anyway, let's leave it at that. This is the Benigni syndrome. That's not how the world works. That's not how it works. That's not how it works in every context. And in Iran, it might not work that way. We invite representatives of the Iranian diaspora on television. I have the utmost respect for the suffering of those people, but they are second or third generation in the West who fled under the Shah, because people with recent experience, and they expect to tell you how the Iranian countryside works, right? How the Iranian countryside works. I know it just like they do. They don't know more than I do, and I'll leave it at that.
allow me a small comment to support what you're saying, but also almost as a question. I could even destroy all the countries in the world and bring them back to tribalism. But because I go back to boots on the ground, I go back to the famous point, I could even completely destroy the country. But since I haven't removed the millions of people there, I've just, can I say bad words? I've just made them as angry as hyenas. So what am I trying to do? I want to go back to what was done in Iraq, what the Americans did in Iraq, because we've experienced this firsthand. I was the first to experience it. When they entered Iraq, they forgot about the history of the Romans, right? The Romans used to say, go there, remove the leader, put in another one more or less, you soften up the people, and at that point you have them under control. The Americans arrived, they erased everything. They erased the state, the armed forces, the police, the city police, the ambulances, the firefighters, they erased everything. So they brought it back to the tribal era. What happened in Iraq before they could even begin to restabilize Iraq? They had to rebuild all those forces, all those national structures with which people, with the same ones who were there before, but who had withdrawn because we would go there and someone who was a sergeant had suddenly become a colonel. Then someone else would come and say, but that guy was a sergeant, the colonel was someone else. And they would fight among themselves. Even today, there are all these problems. So what is it? The point is, what do you really achieve? Because after all, the moment you bring them into a tribal state, and then you have to go and control this tribal state, because you definitely can't do business with a tribal person. I go back, I mean, follow the money trail, and you say either you're stupid or there's something else that doesn't add up. Because if you bring them back to me like this, then how are you supposed to do business? The oil.
I don't know about that. Look at Libya. The tribal chiefs still have control. Business keeps going. They're sucking up oil.
Yes, but not as well as. It took us a while to start doing business with Libya again, let's say small deals, because before, when Libya was intact, the business was big business. I mean, there were billions going back and forth, and we were all doing well. So you bring down all the countries, then once you've brought down Iran, do you think all the others will just stand by and watch? I mean,
I want to talk about another issue, because in the middle of all this mess, as if it wasn't enough, there's also the Lebanon issue beyond the tragic images we see from Tehran. And it seems that by now, well, they've dropped some mines in the Strait of Hormuz. That's pretty much confirmed. If it even ends up on cable news network, that's another point. Yesterday, they hit the latest ship, the Shahid Soleimani class. Again, one of those new frigates and so on. In the end, they lost almost the bulk of the fleet, basically everything, 47 to 49 ships of significant tonnage, let's say. So it was obvious that they had no other way to respond. This is the last ship that was hit yesterday, by the way, filmed by People Calmly. Actually, It's curious that there's still a ship left to hit, isn't it, after all this?
Yes, but if I'm not mistaken, they also started hitting oil tankers in the past few days. I mean, once the naval military targets were finished, they started, in addition to hitting the refineries on land, also hitting the oil tankers. But anyway, let me specify, let me add for those who are watching us, that actually the threat, let's say, that Iran can bring militarily in the Gulf has never really been about those ships that we see burning. I mean, that's really something extra, maybe even a waste, militarily speaking, as an investment. The real threat is exactly that. The last one is about the mines we just read about, and then there are the missiles, the ballistic missiles, and the drones. And at most, there are the small boats, those little ones, basically armed motorboats, which, as we said, hide themselves. They can be.
In my opinion, those hundreds of small boats are more of a nuisance since they're hard to see and intercept and can still cause damage in a narrow strait. Unlike those big ships that are finished, you saw it, 90% were destroyed in the first 24 hours.
And yet Hormuz is still closed anyway. In fact, we see that this wasn't the solution. It's not, it would be easy. Otherwise.
So I also want to address the issue of air superiority, supremacy, and so on, because I see that there are a lot of conflicting things being said about this. I'm saying this because in the short, someone said, "Oh, how can you say that?" and so on. Well, there are drones flying. You don't see any anti-aircraft activity. It's already significant that people were filming. I think they were Reapers. They were filming Reapers, and there was no activity at all. That already makes you understand that if you let them fly, and drones are particularly vulnerable, especially to anti-aircraft, it means there's not much resistance there. By the way, among the confirmed shootdowns of what's left besides the Phantom and the F-14 and F-5 has been seen. By the way, the first aerial shootdown of an Israeli F-35 happened far beyond Tehran. This means they've started to move, at least with the F-35s, with the, let's say, better aircraft deeper in. Another point, in my opinion, important that makes us understand beyond the use of Lancers, B-2S, etc., is that most of the aircraft have switched from standoff weapons, so long range, to JDAMs, so guided weapons. This means they get much closer to the target. It costs less, but you have to get closer. And if you get closer, it's obviously because there isn't much resistance. On the other hand, though, this doesn't mean they've completely lost their defensive capability. As we said at the beginning, most of it is hidden. So for the moment, in some areas of the country, you have air supremacy, in some areas, air superiority. But as soon as they pull out 10 anti-aircraft systems from a mountain, suddenly the situation can change. That corridor can become completely hostile. And above all, I believe that for the Israelis, operating at such a great distance at those times is not easy.
Yes, I can step in on this. I'll say my piece quickly. It's a sort of what we can document, in my opinion, is a kind of middle ground between these two extremes. So we've seen with some geolocated videos of aircraft in flight, even Israelis who actually filmed the video from the F-16, basically to show the mountains below, or even from photos of various weapons used in different Iranian cities. So that's how we can figure out with open source intelligence more or less how far they infiltrate. Because clearly, if we know that such a bomb can be launched, I don't know, from 60 kilometers away, if we see it fall on Tehran, we can say that the Israeli or American fighters got at least as close as 60 kilometers. So using this little evidence we have so far, but it's quite sufficient, there are actually significant penetrations that reach all the way to Tehran. So they're not just attacks, as some still stubbornly claim even in this war, because unfortunately, it's something that, let's say, the supporters keep insisting on, or at least more anti-Western. Sometimes, basically, those who most strongly oppose intervention on social media, let's say, and are passionate about military issues. Some still reject the idea that the air forces, here you can actually see a video from an Israeli aircraft, that the air forces attacking are able to penetrate the airspace. I mean, there's still this theory, which in my opinion is almost a conspiracy theory by now, that almost all attacks are carried out by launching standoff missiles from the border. This was something that was said a lot during the 12-day war. There was already plenty of evidence then that not everything happened at the border. Some people still say it today. In my view, we already have proof like what you see here and several pieces of evidence showing it's actually a mix. There are, especially in the first days, many standoff attacks. So imagine, for example, Tomahawk missiles, and they are mainly used in the first days. These weapons, which are more expensive and are clearly launched from ships from very far away, are rarer. Basically, they are used in the first days, because those are the moments when the Iranian air defenses were still a bit more effective and especially more deployed. Then, once the Iranian air defenses were neutralized.
If you pay attention, Edward, look at what they have on the pylons under the wings.
I missed that.
But you could see JDAMs under the other plane.
Yeah, that's right. Exactly. That's another piece of evidence. It's the equipment, basically, the load that the fighters carry. If you watch the videos of the fighters taking off from the Lincoln carrier, there too, they're often carrying glide bombs. Even if you launch them from a very high altitude, they go less than 160, 70. It depends on the type, the model, so you still have to penetrate deep into the airspace. Iran has had a serious historical shortage, we can say, at least in recent decades, meaning its entire fighter aviation is basically non-existent. They are literally museum pieces. Very beautiful, because they were the ones the Shah bought at the time. Back then, it was a real modern air force, but today they are obviously unusable.
Tom Cruise still flies them. Lies.
What?
Tom Cruise still flies them.
True, they're actually a big loss for Hollywood too. I still think for...
Look, it's very clear here, right? This is a video released on March 6th. Look,
I don't know exactly where this is because I hadn't seen it, but...
They don't say where, but these are recent videos.
Yes. I don't know if it's exactly this or not, but some of these similar videos of this, by geolocating them with the mountains behind or the rivers, they try to confirm some of the incursions more directly. And to add, then just to conclude,
this is geolocated, coordinates 35, 16, 52.30 north, 40.14, 25, 60 east.
Is it in Iran? It's well inside Iran, let's say. Sorry for the unfortunate expressions.
These guys were flying between the Syrian border. They located right between the Syrian border and the border.
And what the weak point is for the Iranian armed forces is the lack of sufficient, both in number and in quality, long-range and high-altitude air and ground defenses. I mean, what the Americans and the Israelis are able to do is not to achieve air dominance over the whole country. No, absolutely not. Also because the country is huge. Imagine having to reach the little northeast corner. It uses a lot of fuel, and the more fuel you carry, the fewer bombs or missiles you can bring. So it just doesn't make sense. However, what they are able to do is achieve temporary control, but this temporary control can also be maintained for days and days. In short, it depends on the number of aircraft and tankers that are used to achieve a sort of temporary control of the medium-high altitudes. And so they can basically do whatever they want with the glide weapons we mentioned. Why are they able to do this so easily? Because the air defenses, the equivalents of the Patriots, the S-300s, they have some S-300s, or rather, they used to have them, but really just a few. Iranian air defenses of this type are very lacking and not sufficient to defend the country, and most of them were then destroyed in the initial attacks. So what is left for Iran? They still have some medium and short-range air defenses. The medium-range ones are those that can sometimes ambush even fighter jets, potentially. As Mirko mentioned earlier, they are usually hidden and pop out from their, let's say, hiding spots. When other sensors detect, let's say, groups of aircraft operating over the country, they briefly try to set up ambushes, but these ambushes are not very easy to carry out. And then we have the air defenses, the really low-end ones, we could say simpler but more numerous, which are extremely difficult, actually impossible to eliminate. They are really easy to hide and can pose a threat to drones. We have seen many observation drones like the Reaper or the Israeli equivalents go down in recent days. Even though it's obviously not yet a sufficient number to jeopardize operations. But it's something that in the long run is a first sign, let's say, of the friction we can also see on the offensive side in this war. That is, if the Iranian apparatus is obviously more damaged militarily. We've seen that the fleet has been destroyed, the air force on the ground has been destroyed, and air defenses have been severely hit. But the first thing we see militarily in terms of damage to the attackers is significant attrition of these drones that they infiltrate throughout Iran to observe and also attack targets. These drones that fly at medium or high altitude. The Iranians shoot them down with their hard-to-find, hard-to-neutralize anti-aircraft weapons. They've reportedly shot down over 20, possibly up to 30, though I can't be certain. The link is available in the sources. And you should know, however, that the American fleet of these aircraft is quite large, probably more than 200 units, but they are used all over the world. So it's not like they can send all 200 there, while the Israeli fleet is much smaller, just a dozen units. So that could already be a bit of a problem. And in the long run, I'll conclude, if the freedom to use these drones for observation and to carry out the most difficult missions were to be lost, obviously, in situations where there's a risk of losing an aircraft, you send the drone. They would have to be replaced with aircraft, for example. They could replace them with F-35s, which have excellent sensors and are obviously also difficult to hit. But for air defense, just imagine the cost of using F-35s to constantly patrol deep inside Iran and look for, say, Iranian launchers that come out for 5 minutes every 6 hours. That means the cost goes up there too. You need tanker planes and so on and so forth.
Let's also look at the issue of the base that was hit, because it's interesting. It was hit again.
Yes, so in these days, I would start by basically saying the damage they caused was critical, besides the ones we mentioned earlier, minor basically to the drone fleet, but significant. The really critical damage, also from the economic value point of view of what they hit, the damage in fact inflicted by Iran. Yes, basically they focused on several radar systems, but really valuable radars in this case, deployed both in the Gulf and in one case even in Jordan. In particular, it seems that between 2 and 3 TPY, 2 model radars were hit, which are basically the radars used for missile defense by the terminal high altitude area defense systems that you have surely heard of. And in particular, their job is to act as early warning radars, that is, as a general rule, missile defense against weapons of this type, used by the Iranians, but also by those used, for example, by the Chinese and the Russians. It works well if it's not enough that is the battery that launches the missiles with the radar that guides the missiles. But first you need a very capable radar, one that can detect the launch of the missiles with plenty of advance warning, so that the launch of the interceptors can also be done with enough advance notice. You can see in these photos some of these radars that have been hit. This one, which you see now, isn't connected to the TAD battery, but maybe even more valuable. It was hit, it seems, by a drone. If you look at the northern side in the damaged image, it appears to have been hit by a drone in Qatar in the early days. If I'm not mistaken, there are only 6 of these in the world. They are gigantic fixed radars, similar to the Aegis Ashore radars or similar ones anyway. So they are really valuable radars, also dedicated to missile defense. So this radar from Qatar could detect the launch shortly after it happened, for example, Iranian ballistic missiles. And so, with a lot of advance warning, they could prepare the launch of the interceptors and know where they would fall. This, on the other hand, is an example of the ones I mentioned earlier, one of the radars related to the terminal high-altitude area defense batteries, which are sometimes also used independently. These are also extremely valuable in the world. Only a few have been manufactured. If I'm not mistaken, they've lost 2, maybe 3 out of 16, just to give you an idea. The annual production capacity is just a few units. If it were to be restarted, of course, they would cost a fortune. And the real problem is that by losing these radars, in theory, the defense against further ballistic launches, if the Iranians manage to...
And excuse me, Eduardo, let's get to the strategy. Knowing that they would lose much of their launch capability, they carefully chose to target all these early warning systems. It makes me think that there will be a second phase when the Americans and Israelis start to feel the strain and won't be able to maintain the pressure they've exerted so far. Suddenly they come out and will be more effective than before the initial phase, because there will be fewer systems to...
Then for...
Guys, I have to say goodnight to you on this one.
Bye, Amedeo.
Greetings to everyone.
Goodbye, Amedeo.
Thanks for the chat. Goodbye, good night.
Goodbye.
It seems like a long-term strategy. I mean, in front of a Mike Tyson, I can't beat him with punches. I give him a punch in the eye and then I come back later.
Absolutely, but the doubt that comes to my mind is then, according to some, Iran is actually playing this sort of 4D chess game. Allow me the joke where basically first they hit the radars, they keep all the missiles, then they'll launch them all together. But in my opinion, if we see it this way, it's a bit unlikely, because in fact, the more time passes. We also have to consider that they lose the launchers for their missiles and it becomes increasingly difficult to launch them. So the more time passes for them as well, the greater the risk that they won't be able to launch large volleys of missiles. However, Having damaged these eyes, which are essential for United States and Israeli defense with such effectiveness, actually means that even the launches, the ones that are fewer in number as we see, are now getting through a bit more. Because obviously, without the perfect early warning we had just weeks ago, individual anti-missile batteries are struggling to intercept. And this could become a really important factor if Iran were to decide to basically hold out indefinitely in this conflict. So refusing any truce, continuing on for months, and above all, if it managed to find a way to get supplies, at least components, from its so-called allies, let's call them that, from China, from Russia, anyway, a way to continue either producing those missiles or at least to replace the launchers it loses. In other words, to be able to launch. Suppose it's 1,015 ballistic missiles per day for months. If it's just a few days, we might think they're done, but firing 15 ballistic missiles daily for 6 months is different. Something would put them in trouble, both the number of interceptors, and they would capitalize on having damaged those radars, because all these ballistic launches would be a bit more effective having damaged those eyes from the start. It must be said, though, and I'll stop here, that today, for example, I saw some news about the transfer that the Americans are making of one of those radars from South Korea as reinforcements. So they are also taking precautions. Obviously, if they replace them, they restore optimal coverage, and Iran can no longer break through them, basically, or damage them. In any case, they will maintain an effective defense.
Let's take the Lebanon issue, because obviously while all this is happening, in the meantime, Israeli casualties have increased because that front has also opened up. And obviously Hezbollah does, what it can. It's interesting to see that even the Lebanese government has started to ask for help for international management to mediate this situation, which certainly won't be the Board of Peace. But there is an interest. They probably want to free themselves from the yoke. In short, now that they are in a moment of weakness, a cautious move by Israel that would cause damage, right at a time when they are offering to meet halfway, well, it would certainly make the situation worse. Does an attack on Lebanon make sense? There was hardly any news about it in the last few months. Daniele,
I'll answer right away. First, confirming the impression you have as well, that something has changed in Beirut in the last few weeks. The Lebanese government, for the first time, has declared and repeated again this morning that Hezbollah is a problem for Lebanon's sovereignty. That is, it has publicly taken responsibility, I want to point out, also with the support of the Speaker of the House, whom he mentions. Let's say there's a split within the group of Hezbollah supporters, which in some way aims to try to implement the agreement that was made a few weeks ago with Trump's envoy, Barak, according to which the Lebanese government was supposed to neutralize Hezbollah. Something it hasn't managed to do, hasn't wanted to do for years, hasn't been able to do, but now, at least from a political point of view, it wants to do. I'll add something that happened 3 days ago. Syria, which has always been a sort of revolving door between Lebanon and the rest of the world, all the way to Iran, he declared that he would prevent Hezbollah from entering Syria. Basically, he closed the border to them. At this point, beyond what many Italian media are saying, who simply seem to say Israel attacks Lebanon without asking themselves. The fact is that 2 years ago, the Israelis basically delivered a tremendous blow. I remind you that 1,200 Hezbollah fighters were hit during the famous operation where they were searching for people, and some were castrated, a few hundred. Syria has helped, Iran is weakened, Israel, and in my opinion, this is the point, this time must remove Hezbollah's presence from southern Lebanon. That's it. I mean, when we say there's a difference, which those who follow your channel immediately noticed, in my opinion, already last week. The big difference between Trump's lack of strategy and Netanyahu's strategy is that Netanyahu is now looking for the big move, the masterstroke. On one hand, really removing Hezbollah's presence from southern Lebanon. I remind you that United Nations interim force in Lebanon has been there for 18 years. With substantial Italian leadership, which should have somehow prevented Hezbollah from attacking northern Israel every now and then. The Israelis go in every time to do a job that United Nations interim force in Lebanon either doesn't want to do or can't do and hasn't done. This time, in my opinion, Israel is trying to achieve two things at once: to remove Hezbollah from southern Lebanon. When the Lebanese government, as you mentioned yourself just 3 hours ago, asked for international mediation, basically they said, we want to kick them out, but we can't do it alone. The Israeli response was, we're not going to solve this problem for you. You have to solve it yourselves. You're a sovereign state. You have to take care of it yourselves. But in my opinion, this will make things very interesting, because if Netanyahu manages to achieve the result of really removing it, Hezbollah from southern Lebanon, basically siding with the Lebanese army, even though it's an underpaid army made up of ragtag soldiers, fundamentally with very little military capability, but somehow he brings home the prize. The other thing I'll add is when you were talking at the beginning about American boots on the ground, I have to tell you that I'm more and more convinced that it will be the Israelis, even with regard to Iran, to go, if they're not already there, knowing a bit, if they're not already there, they'll definitely go to the Isfahan area. Let me remind you of an operation they did.
And where most of it is produced.
Let me remind you of an operation, exactly. Let me remind you of an operation the Israelis carried out in 2007 because I followed it. I talked about it with the advisor to the President of the United States. Bush, he came as a guest to Johns Hopkins University in Washington a few years ago, and this was the operation. You remember that the Syrians were building a nuclear plant on the border with Turkey. Well, Netanyahu, because then he goes here and there. He was already in power 20 years ago. He called Bush and said, President, will you solve the nuclear plant problem for me? Bush said, I can't do it, but if you do it, I'll give you a hand. Bush's advisor confirmed to me that not only did the Israelis go through, but also through Turkish territory. The Turks hadn't seen anything either, but there were already Israeli soldiers on the ground wearing Syrian army uniforms around the nuclear plant. So, if tomorrow morning it turns out that the Israelis are already around some strategic points for Israel, Israel doesn't have a problem destroying them. In my opinion, for the Iranian leadership, Israel has been a problem to get rid of for 47 years. The risk of being destroyed by a regime that does not recognize Israel and considers it a fundamental target. In my opinion, the Israelis can handle it. The Israelis, unlike the Americans, Mirko, have a public opinion that is perfectly capable of handling it. Even death, the loss of hundreds of men in an operation.
They are more or less used to being under siege or at war.
Exactly, Trump. After the 7th death this morning, they started, if you check American websites, legitimately asking themselves, but if this president who wanted peace is so convinced that it's right to fight, why doesn't he send his own son? And Trump's answer was, because my son is too tall, he's too tall to be admitted into the forces. American armed forces. They immediately posted online some American soldiers who are even taller than Trump's son and Mrs. Melania, to say that they are two different countries, not only in strategy, but also in the ability to resolve things, or the attempt to resolve once and for all, or at least for many years to come, the Iran issue.
This explains a bit. Esfahan is an area where all the nuclear plants, enrichment facilities, and these things are located, and this is the biggest one. Iranian oil-rich area. The battlefields of the Iran-Iraq war were all basically here in this area because that's where the wealth is. So it's interesting. Danilo, did you take part in United Nations Interim Force in Lebanon during your career?
No, never.
But you heard from colleagues and so on, I imagine, right?
Yes, yes.
What was their opinion about the mission?
But the UNIFIL mission, honestly, I can't really talk about it much now. I might risk giving more of my own opinion than a certainty. But the UNIFIL mission almost seems like it's a mission that's mostly, let's say, for show. Let's put it that way. They don't really have much power. They don't have much ability to act, to move, to operate. They're mostly just there. It's like saying, okay, we're here. We want to give you a hand. We're trying to help. But that's how I understood it. That's how I've always perceived it. They don't have the ability to move, but not in the sense that they wouldn't be able to. It's that they simply don't have it. They don't have the structure, the means, the command and control. It's not there. It's like if you open a barracks in a city, you put 50 soldiers inside, that's it, done. Okay, you stay here, don't go out. Sometimes you can go on leave. Yes, but please, if someone shoots at you, close the gate. That's it, don't say anything.
Many soldiers I've talked to who have been there said, we need someone to send us there. People who are about to retire, so you do 6 months there, which feel like twice as long. And two of them said, we help the local population. And I asked, in what way? And he joked about it. He said, we help the sale of sandwiches because where we are, all the sandwich vendors come, those who sell these things. I mean, for the rest,
all the peace operations that have been carried out with context, with structures, with strategies, with ideas for the future to carry forward. And from that moment on, the operations were set up. They started to move forward to carry on these contexts, these ideas. That, on the other hand, I repeat, is a barracks. It was put there. It's filled with people. A barracks now, it's filled with people who, by the way, are not from just one nation. That's it. We leave them there. We do more or less. Come on, you have your nice helmets. You have your nice things. We make our presence known. But then, well, if they start fighting, just step back for a moment and then maybe we'll talk with Tizio and Caio. This is the idea I got talking with colleagues, with people who have been there.
It's the same one I have when I talk to a lot of soldiers. They told me, in the end, we're there, but as soon as a bullet flies, we... So you're not a peacekeeping force. You just stand there and watch. You don't do anything.
No, no, no.
Go ahead, Daniela.
I'll give you an answer because I experienced this situation from this side of the border, that is from the Israeli side. I'll tell you an episode that I've never mentioned before. About 10 years ago, there was an international conference on counterterrorism in Israel, and a government minister showed up. Guess who? Netanyahu, because this thing has been going on for 30 years now. And when he finds out I'm Italian, he launches into a crazy tirade and starts saying, you Italians are a bunch of frauds with this whole United Nations interim force in Lebanon thing. Because you're there, like Danilo just said, buying sandwiches, handing out notebooks to elementary school kids. I was really hurt by that because after all, they're Italian soldiers. I've seen them in many parts of the world, and in some places they're fantastic. For example, in Afghanistan, in Mozambique, in Kosovo, for instance. There's an operation in some way to maintain order, but managed, in my opinion. UNIFIL today I was really upset by it. Some Israeli professors, though, as soon as the minister finished speaking, because I said, listen, after all, we Italians have, 1,200 soldiers there at our own expense, risking their lives and so on. You don't come like that in such an unfriendly way. Some Israeli professors rushed over. As soon as he finished speaking, they told me, for heaven's sake, don't take this as an attack on your government. This leads me to share my impression, to answer the question that Mirko asked. in addition to what Danilo is saying. In my opinion, for 18 years, we were there with our eyes wide open, really wide open. I mean, if I can say this at this late hour, in my opinion, those eyes were open not just for us Italians. It's like the reaction of our Israeli friends that day made me think that the problem wasn't about not offending the Italian government, but that having the Italians was the lesser evil. Also remember one thing, that the contingents there, as you mentioned, are from various countries. There are Spaniards, maybe even French, and so on. Anyway, traditionally, the Italians have always had an excellent relationship with the Israeli army. Historically, Italy has worked better than other countries, let's put it that way. So my impression is that in a sort of you don't ask and I don't tell, they try to keep it that way. The problem is that with the Hamas attack in Gaza, and then right after the Hezbollah attack from the north against Israel, Israel at that point said, now we're ending this. I insist what is happening these days will most likely be decisive regarding Lebanon. That is, the Israelis can't just go in like the other times, shoot, drop a few bombs, and then withdraw. This time they have the chance to settle the score in southern Iran. We all remember that 18 years ago, United Nations interim force in Lebanon arrived, because in return, the Israelis agreed to withdraw from that strip of Lebanese territory from which Hezbollah used to attack northern Israel almost every day. So now, for Israel, Lebanon, having somehow dealt with Syria, and Iran become an opportunity for Netanyahu and also for the opposition. If you look, even the opposition, there isn't a single person in Israel who says, no, we won't do it, contrary to what usually happens. As Mirko was saying, in American public opinion, which is mostly against this war, in Israel it's in favor. Tehran is 2 hours by plane from Tel Aviv, so geography also matters, the proximity of a threat or not. Let me remind you of something else. In Israel, there are between 200 and 250,000 Jews of Persian origin. So there are 1,000 reasons to say, let's try to solve this issue now.
It depends. If they focus only on Hezbollah, yes. If they strike a bit randomly, obviously, it will be much more difficult.
No. This time, in my opinion, the agreement, which in some way formally the Lebanese government had reached in recent weeks, this time the Lebanese have an interest in, let's say, reaffirming their own sovereignty. Let's never forget that X years ago, the port of Beirut exploded. They immediately said it was the Israelis' fault. Then, when a vague investigation was carried out, the responsibility fell on Hezbollah. Hezbollah are not just brave fighters who launch missiles at the Israelis every morning. They are also a major problem for the rest of Lebanon, which is made up of people who I believe have the right to live a relatively, let's say, peaceful life, with at least some prospects for the future. The problem is that even that population has become a victim. Not only the north of Israel, but also the Lebanese have become victims of this Hezbollah situation. And the geostrategic game today allows something that, in my opinion, wasn't possible until just a few months ago. Forget about hitting them and pulling back, hitting them while United Nations interim force in Lebanon just took notes. 5 bombs, 4 sandwiches, and that's it.
If I may, I want to say my piece on this because, in my opinion, on one hand, I actually agree in a way. I think that between Israel and the United States, Israel is the one that has much more strategy in everything we see. And I also believe that they might seize the opportunity to settle this Hezbollah issue once and for all. But I can't help but notice, I mean, in my opinion, there are some huge human aspects missing from the discussion. I mean, we said that the population, is completely left out of the discussion. The suffering of the Lebanese population, we're talking about Israel, ordered the evacuation of 700,000 people in the past few days. Here the scale In my opinion, obviously, we don't have time to talk about it, but let's not forget what also happened in Gaza. I mean, in my opinion, we shouldn't forget the relationships, the context, and the suffering of the populations we're talking about. If we have to make this point, because frankly, if we were to look at just the raw numbers, how many civilian deaths are caused by Hezbollah and how many by Israel, how many populations, how many lives are ruined, basically due to forced evacuations. One could say, sure, Hezbollah doesn't surrender. In fact, it resists, it doesn't withdraw. But Israel operates outside its borders. Israel operates in another state here. And it's not even the place where it does the worst things.
Also, on the other side,
Not even.
as if by coincidence, while you were saying this, Hezbollah terrorists entered a Christian village in southern Lebanon.
I mean,
everyone operates in someone else's territory. Let's say that's right.
Tonight, because in fact, it wasn't the subject, in fact, of my speech. But already the victims that Israel has caused in Lebanon these days are hundreds of deaths from bombings. By now, let's say, even in public discourse, the weight of the death of an Israeli civilian, for heaven's sake, poor guy, who gets hit by a missile that comes from Iran, maybe, while he's going to the shelter, or launched by Hamas or Hezbollah. But the weight that the deaths of these different populations have in all this discussion is vastly different. If you'll allow me this term, I mean, the suffering is not at all, let's say, comparable in what we see. For this reason, I'll stop here and let you respond if you want. For this reason, I understand the discussion about the Israeli strategy, let's say, in a certain sense, but I find it something abominable from a human and moral point of view. And unfortunately, it could work, but I think it's something that, I mean, is a crime of order of magnitude. Greater than all those they are trying to fight instead of, let's say, fighting Hezbollah's reaction and so on. Please.
I don't know if I'm at risk of saying something that often, I think that often people just don't want to hear certain realities, which are the realities of war, of confrontation, of combat, and of truly eliminating the problem. I absolutely don't feel like justifying anything that happened. So don't take what I'm saying as a justification or as support for one side or the other, not even as a political statement, because then I politics even worse. But when there's a conflict and the conflict keeps going, small clashes here and there, small clashes here and there that keep going, 5, 10, 20, 25, 30, 35, 50 years, at a certain point someone says enough, now I've had enough. So either I manage to find the solution, the right balance, and if to find that balance, I have to clean things up. Is it bad to say that? I don't know. Is it something that's humanly bearable? How bad is it to say? No, in fact, many people do that. I'm not looking, I'm not seeing, I'm not hearing. But I don't even feel like saying that it's totally wrong. And I'm one of those who, first of all, said everything. You can act, but you can't destroy an entire population when you're fighting a terrorist group. Because first of all, when that started, I said, it's as if to fight the mafia, we went to Sicily and wiped Sicily clean. Or to fight the 'Ndrangheta, we went to Calabria and wiped Calabria clean.
Danilo, have you seen the series Fauda? It's an Israeli series.
No.
I recommend you watch it. No, watch it. I recommend you watch the series Fauda, because it tells the story of a Mossad group that goes after terrorists from the inside like that. You know what you learn as the series goes on? Fauda and Faida both realize that this spiral of hatred will lead them all to die. Because in the end, all the members of the Mossad team start dying. Their fathers get killed, their girlfriends get killed, and the same thing happens to those on the other side. This spiral of pain, which if you look at it, almost foreshadows.
In fact, and this is what I was saying before, the more you keep pushing this thing forward, and you can't find a solution from the point of view of agreements of peace in some way, the more you bring it to the point of saying either A or Z, there are no more letters in between. You can't go through any other letter of the alphabet. It could be today, It could have been 20 years from now. They could have done it 20 years ago, maybe when there were no social media. Things would have been done in a simpler way, more chop chop. No one would have noticed because many newspapers didn't talk about it, and that's it. But that's probably how it is. You also need the people who are in that place to do those things. In part, there are some concepts that are so difficult to understand and to put on the table, but they are concepts that should be analyzed. Why do I say this? Because I've been in many wars. I found myself in many territories where wars were happening. I've spoken with both the right and the left, and something that was striking for me, striking in my own mind, was finding myself in Bosnia talking with a Serb and a Bosnian. They were friends before the war, shot at each other during the war, and became friends again after the war. When I asked, "Why did you do this?" they replied, "In war, he's my enemy. I have to shoot." There are human dynamics that we sometimes really don't understand. So it's difficult. I mean, yes.
You have to experience them.
I mean, you have to be in their shoes because otherwise it's humanly impossible to understand.
To sum up, I highly recommend the series. At first, knowing it was made by Israelis, I had the same reaction, thinking they're the good guys and the others are the bad guys.
I'm going to watch it. I'm going to watch it. I like these things.
What an honest series, because the more you go on, the more it is. In all of them, there are team members who want to leave because they realize the longer you stay there, sooner or later they'll kill your brother, your son, and so on. If you're caught in that spiral, you won't get out alive. And everyone realizes it on both sides, and they don't know how to get out because then hatred, revenge leads to more revenge, and so on. And then we get to October 7th, the next series, which should be coming out soon. In 2026, I think it will be largely based on October 7th in Sioux. And I think that series, an Israeli series made by Israelis that tells this story, was, so to speak, almost a denunciation. We need to find another way to stop this, which is clearly the opposite message Netanyahu took. But someone, at least within their cultural world, let's say in films, series, and so on, that was the message they wanted to send. We have to stop this spiral because neither we nor they can survive outside of it.
Look, it's always there. After a while, soldiers, once they start fighting, they start thinking about it. Remember that at a certain point in his life, a soldier starts to think that on the other side, there's another soldier, just like him, who has been told to shoot at me because I'm the bad guy. So who is the bad guy? And you start to ask yourself this very question. You stop for a moment and say, who is really the bad guy?
Yes, also because to avenge their fallen friend, they have to do things outside the rules more and more and so on. They become very similar to those they were hunting.
Yes, of course. It's not that. Hey, okay, otherwise we get into other things. Send me where I can watch this series.
Fauda, Fauda, Netflix.
Hey, no, but because I have nothing to write with, I have my memory. I had already lost it.
Following these events, I hope to come back in the next few days with a live stream about Ukraine, since it's been 10 days since we talked about it. There aren't any major updates, but we still need to cover it. Unless something sensational happens in the next few days.
Maybe.
So many thanks to everyone who stopped by: Danilo Amelotti, Daniele Moro, Eduardo Fontana, Maddaluno. See you soon. Good night.
Greetings to everyone.